Health and safety assignment 3, risk assessment. So the first thing to do is to think about how you plan for risk assessment. So what do you need to know for this? Plan for risk assessment P4. M3, conduct a detailed risk assessment. So we want you to actually make one. So P4, you're basically saying what do you need to do before you actually do the risk assessment. M3, you're doing the risk assessment. D1, you're doing any potential improvements. How to plan for a risk assessment. So the format, this is actually the typical format of a risk assessment, and I've put one bit in there. So we'll talk about these different bits in more detail as we go along, but the first thing you need to do is actually assess the risk. In terms of assessing risk, all a risk is basically something that bad that might happen, and in terms of moderate or high risk, it might be the fact that it might be high risk. It might be like a fire, which is actually, has a low likelihood of happening, but it's a high risk in terms of life. So that's the way you've got to think about it. There are things which would happen quite frequently, like slips, trips, and falls. Someone might break a wrist or something like that, but the reality is it's not that bad, and it can be managed. It's an accident. So that's how you judge. So that would be almost, it would have quite a high chance of happening, but it would actually be quite a low risk to life, unless it had an underlying medical condition. Who might be harmed? So in this example, I put staff or students. What controls are in place? Now, a control is anything you use to mitigate that risk. Now, that could simply be by informing someone, or making a time plan, or doing something as simple as a cable tie around the back of a set of computers, or making sure that you keep something tidy. That is a control. Any further controls which are needed, and basically when any other actions need to be completed by. So this was a date. This risk assessment was for a trip. That was the date of the trip, and that was done this year, I think. Frequency, it should be reviewed every year as a matter of course, okay? Or if a variable changes. Now that could be if new students come in, or if, let's say, a student became pregnant, I would have to change it because the variable has changed. It could be, let's say, this was going to the mall. It could be there could be some works, or some building works happening in the mall that I might need to consider, or something that might happen. Basically, as we talked about what a risk is, all the content is basically based on risk. Now, all a risk is likelihood of something something happening which has an undesired outcome. That means something negative or damaging, and it's basically created by the activity that you're doing. Now, the whole point of a risk assessment is to manage that and control it. That's the point of it. And that's what that document does. As we talked about that. And industry best practice is anything which goes to the extra mile of health and safety. So anything which helps, keep people safe. That could be anything, but anything which, so for example, in the past, I've done risk assessments when I've taken students out. I think a couple of years ago I had to do one for, I had to basically write another risk assessment for a student who was pregnant, on top of the risk assessment I'd done, but I did that to make sure that I kept that student safe. So that's something that you could do, which is the extra mile. Equally, if there's a student with specific needs which might need managing on a trip, you might need to do that. In terms of a classroom, it could be, again, looking at the needs of the individuals in there and actually being specific towards it. The example I've given you, I talked broadly about those things, like asthma, as an example, but the reality is, I'm not going to give you a document with loads of students' names on it, but it does highlight, different needs of that cohort, and how I actually managed that and reacted to it. Industry-related experience, well, obviously I'm a teacher, I have to write risk assessments of certain activities, and then again you see my risk assessment there, which you can find on Moodle as a guide and reference point. Okay, well, following from that, M1, you need to actually create a risk assessment. Now you can find a template on Moodle, all you have to do is fill it in. What I would do is maybe consider something like a classroom or the LRC or the canteen at a push, but what I would do is keep it simple. You don't need to go and risk assess absolutely everything, but just risk assess something which is calm. Now that could be IT room, it could be the LRC, just keep it simple. Now you need to think about what that room's used for and if any risk could be made from that. Who's using the room, in terms of learners, what kind of needs they have, how can the room be made safe. So for example, are there any issues with bags, coats, is there issues with tidiness or cleanliness, the types of activities in the room. Now that could actually be a whole different variety of things. So for example, an IT room isn't, personally, I don't think it's the greatest room to teach in, but there's certain activities that are made difficult because it's being an IT room. The equipment the equipment that's actually used in the room, so chairs, tables, and computers. Do you have to consider different things for that? The maximum numbers of students who can actually fit into a room. That is actually quite a topical issue within the college at the moment. And it's an important thing to look at. Any fire or electrical issues which might come up. Also, I know it sounds very basic, but actually how do you enter or exit the room? Is it safe? Also, what would happen in a fire to that door or entrance? That's really important because it can cause a lot of hazards and a lot of issues for people, and that's something you might want to look at or think about. It sounds like a really basic thing, but that's something you'd actually have to consider. As I said, you've got a demonstration one you can have a look at. Obviously it's for a trip, but it gives you an idea of the kind of things that I have to think about. Some of those things are clearly not going to happen. So for example, you might want to think about in terms of risks of if you've got a violent student, but the reality is it might be quite low. D1, you need to actually make any recommendations. You need to form a report for improving the health and safety standards and practices in the part of the college you've conducted your risk assessment. Now, you could look at something like training or staff development, but that could also be the training of students. Are people aware of the hazard? Could you make people aware of it? So for example, could you do a poster or make or a sign? Could you make a learner representative of it or something like that? Could you again raise awareness of it? And also, could you benchmark it? Is there actually a better example of that in the college of making something safe? Could you actually hold it up as best practice? Use of equipment in accordance with what's going on. In terms of rest breaks, do we, is that factored in? Any safety devices which are in the room, any checking of equipment, procedures for recording and reporting accidents, organisations and legislative requirements, and review of action plans, and any insurance. I would say the college does have insurance, okay, so that's one you could probably strike off. The college is insured for pretty much every activity that's taking place within it.